What is Open RAN and why does policy and regulation matter? Open RAN is a concept that decouples the hardware and software components of the radio access network, which enables interoperability and integration of different vendors and technologies. This will actually allow mobile operators to mix and match solutions from various suppliers rather than just one, thereby reducing vendor lock-in and increasing competition and diversity in the market. So Open RAN also enables the use of cloud-based and virtualized platforms, which can improve scalability. So as you upgrade, you can upgrade the various segments of the RAN and automation of the network. But as an emerging standard, introducing Open RAN entails looking at the policy environment. This is something that probably people in the technology sector would often overlook. Why is policy important? Because policy actually sets the parameters, and the agencies who enforce the policy decide on the adoption of standards. So policy and regulator and the regulation itself can encourage or enable the use of Open RAN or not. In fact, several studies have actually pointed out that the disconnect between policy and technology in the Philippines is a major reason for our poor state of digital infrastructure. So this session aims to promote awareness and appreciation for the importance of public policy and regulation and how they may affect the adoption of Open RAN in the Philippines. Here are just some of the topics that I hope to discuss today. Due to time constraints, we cannot actually do a deep dive into each of the topic, but we'll focus on the most important and relevant topics. So in a nutshell, these are the key messages of the lecture. Like all industries, telecoms is governed by policy and regulation, which set the parameters for, among other things, how industry players can enter the market, how they operate, or whether they would thrive or not, and which standards they can adopt. The Philippines uses analog era policy and regulation that may hamper innovation and prevent the adoption of new technologies and standards like Open RAN. Policy reforms that can support Open RAN include removal of the congressional franchise for putting up a network, something that is very unique to the Philippines. Also removing the franchise for spectrum use, as well as getting a permit for demonstrating wireless technology, which still needs an endorsement from a telco with a franchise. Regional licensing of spectrum can also be useful, and perhaps a special financing mechanism to support the deployment of Open RAN in unserved and underserved areas. But in the end, we have to remember that it's market adoption that will best determine the fate of a tech standard. Okay, so let's start by talking about the concept of public policy. So this is just a crash course on policy. Policy is a purposive course of action followed by an actor or set of actors in dealing with the problem. So when you talk of policy, any group can have a policy, like companies or a small group, homeowners associations have policies. But what makes public policy different is that it's a decision made by the government that applies to a particular area of activity. So bear in mind that when the word public here means the state, and the state represented by the government. Anything that the government consciously chooses to do, or even those that they choose not to do, is actually considered public policy. Most of the time, public policy attempts to get people like you and I, or enable us to do things that we would otherwise not have done. Regulation is a particular type of public policy that seeks to control or direct behavior, again, getting us to do something we would otherwise not have done, impose controls and restrictions on specific activities. Hence the word regulation that comes from the word regulate. In policy and regulation, the government is the primary actor. It has the unique ability to make the authoritative decision operative word authoritative on behalf of the citizens. So as a side note, we have to remember that policy directly affects our lives. So please don't vote for policymakers whose decisions don't represent your values or your interests. So whenever we vote, we have to make that connection. Ano bang nangyayari sa paligid ko tsaka sa buhay ko? And what's the connection with policymakers? Apart from government, non-government actors may also influence government decisions. Usually, when making policy or regulation, non-government actors such as business, civil society, social groups can provide inputs via public hearings or stakeholder consultations, or also through informal means. So if public policy is the what, policy making is the why and how. So it is a very, well, it is inherently political actually, because policy making involves people with conflicting interests, values, and desires. It is essentially a problem solving process, and it involves several steps. So for example, actually the one that you see on the screen is just a very basic and simplified policy cycle. So agenda setting, for example, you list, the policymakers list a set of legitimate problems that merit attention. Hindi naman lahat dapat ng problem gawin natin ilagay sa agenda, di ba? Sa dami ng problema ng mundo or ng Pilipinas, policymakers need to focus on the most legitimate problems. In policy formulation, that's where policy is drafted. It's designed to remedy a particular problem, whether real or potential. So kahit imagine problem pa lang, policy usually would like to look at potential problems that may arise. Decision making is the actual choosing among the various alternatives of the policy that is likely to address a particular problem. So this is actually the most political stage, because this is where the haggling, the negotiation, and the compromises take place. After you choose a policy, there's policy implementation. Well, that's when the programs or policies are being carried out. So here at this stage, it's very important to see who implements the policy and what are the factors that that affect the implementation of the policy. And finally, evaluation. And I think as a policy researcher, evaluation is where the Philippines is very weak at. This is where we find out the results of policy implementation and whether a policy is actually accomplishing its expected goals. So after this, the government can decide whether a policy will be kept, will be changed, or terminated. Okay. So when you go to school or when you study public policy, the textbooks will tell you that the policy cycle looks something like this, just like what I mentioned earlier. But what is policy making really like? Basically, various stakeholders are competing to get in, to influence the process, policymakers, and each other. Policymaking is a balancing act, and the result is often a compromise or of various positions and interests. So what you're seeing here is something that actually happens in real life. I am an ICT policy researcher, but I'm also a practicing policy analyst. So whenever I engage with policymakers, whether in Congress or in the executive branch, this is really what it actually looks like on the ground. But the important thing here to remember is that as part of civil society or as part of the private sector, we have the right and the power to influence policy. Okay. So let's briefly talk about the Philippine public policy environment. The 1987 Constitution, as you probably all know, is the highest law of the land. It vested the power of government on the legislative, executive, and judiciary. So the legislative power or making the laws in the form of Republic Acts is vested in Congress. So we have a bicameral legislature, which means that there are two houses, no? Or two chambers, as others would call them. It's the Senate as the upper house and Congress, or House of Representatives, as the lower house. A Republic Act actually provides a high-level or macro policy framework. It starts with an RA, or a Republic Act starts as a bill in Congress, and then both houses need to approve the bill, and then they transmit it to the president, who needs to sign it before an RA can be enacted into a law. So it's not only Congress that passes a law, the president is actually very important as well. So next is the executive power, which is vested in the president. The president is our chief executive, exercising control over all departments, bureaus, and offices in the executive branch. The executive branch actually is the one that implements the laws. So the president is head of the state and head of the government, and also the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. So one example of a policy, public policy, that the president can issue is an executive order, which is often issued to help executive agencies or departments under the president's control, help them implement a law more effectively. So after Congress passes a law, then the executive branch implements the law through the executive departments. Now, the government agencies under the president, they themselves can actually issue public policy. This can be in the form of department circulars or memorandum circulars. Basically all serving as implementing guidelines, rules, and regulations for implementing a law. Lastly, we have the judicial power, which is vested in one Supreme Court and lower courts, and also the Court of Appeals. So just very quickly, the judiciary's power is to settle controversies involving legal rights. And the Supreme Court is usually the one that interprets the laws whenever other government offices need guidance on it. So all branches can issue public policy, but all of them need to issue policies that must follow the Constitution. Okay. What are the various government agencies with a direct mandate on telecommunications in the ICT sector? So of course, number one, we have the Department of ICT. It's the primary planning, policy, coordinating, implementing, and administrative entity of the executive branch. It's also responsible for planning, developing, and promoting national ICT development agenda. Please take note that ICT, or Information and Communications Technology, also includes telecommunications and the internet under the sector. So it also has the mandate to promote the development of digital infrastructure and also the use of most cost-effective and emerging technologies. In fact, the DICT has been championing the use of emerging technologies since the first national broadband plan that was issued in 2016. So attached to the DICT, you have here under the DICT, for policy and program purposes and coordination purposes, we have the National Telecoms Commission, the National Privacy Commission, and the Cybercrime Investigation and Coordination Center, or CICC. Please take note that while they are attached to the DICT, each of these bodies are actually independent and autonomous, which means that the DICT as the policy-making body cannot dictate upon, let's say, the NTC, for example, when it makes regulatory decisions. However, the DICT can issue policy frameworks that can serve as a guide or can set the policy direction for regulation. The National Privacy Commission, in particular, has its own charter, which is contained in the Data Privacy Act of 2012. It basically administers and implements data privacy protection in the Philippines. So, okay, next slide. So the DICT was created in 2016 by a Republic Act, RA 10844. So these are the different functions of the DICT as explained earlier. Please take note that The DICT was created in 2016, while its attached agency, the National Telecommunications Commission, was created in 1979. So parang mother agency ni NTCC-DICT. So it's sort of a weird situation where the child is like 37 years older than the parent. I'm pointing this out because, as I mentioned earlier, public policy is basically about negotiating, compromising various interests. And it's also about, the jurisdiction of each of the policymakers. So having a situation where the attached agencies are much older than the mother agency has actually created some challenges in terms of policymaking and regulation, which anyone in the policymaking field must be aware of. Kung baga ang technical issues, madali yan. Pero ang mga people issues at jurisdictional issues, yun ang mas mahirap. Okay. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, the NTC, let's go now to the NTC, is the regulator of the telecommunications industry. It has actually a long list of responsibilities. Actually, the list of responsibilities of the NTC has been growing since 1979 pa siya. It's been growing ever since digital connectivity became more pervasive. But the most important ones include authorization, which is the issuance of certificates and permits. It includes licenses for public telecommunications entities or PTEs, or those who are in the business of providing telecom services, including mobile network services, radio and TV broadcast, and cable television, as well as permits for value-added service providers, or VAS, which includes internet service providers. In terms of regulation, the NTC regulates the construction, operation, and maintenance and other activities related to radio stations. Radio station ang tawag sa batas because it's a very, very old law from the 1930s, but this also pertains to any, basically any service that uses radio equipment, including cell sites. It also includes prescribing rules and regulations and standards to ensure the quality, safety, reliability, security, compatibility, and interoperability of facilities and services in conformity with national and international standards. But since the Philippines is not an equipment manufacturing country, usually we don't really have local standards for equipment. But for security, for safety, reliability, we do have those. Okay. The NTC also has the sole mandate, as of today, in radio spectrum management. So, management requires classification of identification of spectrum, allocation of spectrum to a particular service. Kanina nasa quiz nyo yun. Assignment of spectrum to a particular entity. So, ang allocation is a chunk of spectrum band being allocated for a particular service. Let's say, mobile service, broadband wireless access, or maybe for the maritime. Actually, as you would all know better than me, spectrum is not only used by telecommunications, it's used by any industry that uses wireless technology. So allocation of spectrum is responsibility of the NTC. However, since the Philippines is a signatory or a member state of international standards organizations such as the International Telecommunications Union of the United Nations, spectrum allocation is usually something that is already predetermined na. So spectrum assignment is actually the most important function then of the NTC. So the NTC also has the mandate to review spectrum utilization, spectrum being a very scarce public resource. very limited, finite. So the review of utilization needs to be a very important task. And also the NTC has the mandate to set spectrum user fee or SUF for the use of spectrum. Okay. The NTC actually gets its mandate from several policies. So unlike for example, the ICT, which gets its mandate from RA 10844, or the National Privacy Commission that gets its mandate from Republic Act 10173 or the Data Privacy Act. Si NTC, marami siyang mga policies, no, that it needs to adhere to. So the mother policy that created it was an EO from 1979, and then it also gets its mandate from Act 3846, the Radio Control Law of 1931. Of course, hindi pa NTC ang tawag noon. In fact, noong 1931, it was the Secretary of Commerce and Industry that was mandated to manage spectrum. And finally, the NTC also gets its mandate from Republic Act 7925 or the Public Telecommunications Policy Act. Okay. So technology is constantly changing together with business models, even the supply chain, and the various activities that come with technological advancements. These technological advancements can be likened to a revolution. So one author actually likened it to a revolution due to its velocity, the scope or the impact it can make, and as well as the system's impact. So in the past, for example, the invention of the printing press or the steam engine actually had governments grappling with how to regulate them. Primarily, how to ensure safety, but also how to, which entails putting standards in place, but also how to get money from these innovations, diba? So, syempre, when you earn income, when you start making profit, the government needs to make sure that you are being taxed properly. So suffice it to say that when technology changes, si government talagang nararattle siya. Kailangan niya talagang mag-catch up. So what more with digital technologies that evolve in just a few years or even just a few months, di ba? Like AI, nagbabago siya every month, even every few weeks. So policy and regulation often play catch up with technological changes. Legislation in particular, those policies that are passed by Congress could be out of date by the time they are passed or implemented. But despite the rapid changes in technology, policy making must operate with a clear foundation of values for guidance. So for example, in telecommunications, despite the various technological advancements in telecoms, the policymaker can actually use basic principles. What are these? Universal ICT access, consumer rights, protecting consumer rights, and promoting fair competition among various providers. Okay. So let's talk about the mobile network services, and then the policy and regulation that impact this industry. So for mobile networks, there are two important policy frameworks that I already mentioned earlier. Si 7925 or the Public Telecoms Policy Act of 1995 and si Act 3846 or the Radio Control Law of 1931. The Radio Control Law was last amended in 1950, but it did not really make a huge difference. No, it actually just added more permits. Trivia: bakit siya Act 3846? Bakit si RA Republic Act? So Act 3846 siya because, and this is really testament to how outdated this law is. When Act 3846 was enacted, the Philippines was not yet a republic and also not yet a commonwealth. So it was under American rule. And at the time, the legislature passes what's called public acts. So yun yung tawag sa mga batas before. But then that public act needs to be approved by the American Governor General in the Philippines kasi sakop tayo ng Americans before. That's why it's called Act and not Republic Act. But in 1935, we actually became a Commonwealth. So the law after the Radio Control Law, which was the Public Service Act that was passed in 1936, was already called a Commonwealth Act. And then finally, when we became a republic, naging Republic Act. Okay, game. RA 7925. So the Public Telecommunications Policy Act provides the general framework for the telecom sector. It is primarily concerned with entities providing telecom services to the public for a fee. So this is the final act of the Ramos administration to liberalize and break PLDT's monopoly at the time. So one of the things that that's very important when setting a policy is the objective. So during the Ramos administration, the objective was to break the monopoly of PLDT, which at the time was the only local exchange operator who also owned the backbone and international gateway facilities. So RA 7925 encouraged more private sector players in telecommunications, and it also opened up the mobile radio telephone industry. Under RA 7925, there are actually 4 categories of telecommunications. The local exchange service for landlines, the fixed landline telephone, the inter-exchange carrier service, or the backbone used for for national long distance, the international carrier or the gateway used for making international calls, and the mobile radio telephone system. Meron pa dyang actually, paging system, ganyan, pero hindi ko na sinama. So, a mobile radio telephone system is defined by law as a wide area mobile radio telephone system with its own switch, base station, transmission facilities that's capable of providing mobile telecom by utilizing radio frequencies. Okay. A mobile radio service or a mobile network operator, MNO, is a public telecoms entity. So, it is required to obtain a franchise from Congress before it can commence or conduct its business. And after that, a Certificate of Public Convenience and Necessity or CPCN from the NTC. And the NTC, through that CPCN, can impose various conditions, including standards or the technical aspects of the equipment to be used by the operator. So just a side note, before RA 7925 was passed, former President Fidel Ramos actually started liberalizing the telecom sector through a series of executive orders. So he issued, the late President Ramos issued EO 59 and EO 109, which were critical for interconnection and universal access service. In fact, during the early 1990s, mobile radio telephone operators began to have interest in the Philippines, and they were already starting to invest in mobile, which at the time was a very, very new and emerging technology. Analog pa siya nun, analog mobile. Okay, so so the next law is Act 3846, or the Radio Control Law. Under this law, mobile network operator must also obtain a congressional franchise before the NTC can grant it the permit to construct or install radio station and also use spectrum. So if you want to use radio spectrum, whoever you are and however small scale your deployment is, network deployment is, you are required to get a congressional franchise. So the law also requires an MNO to obtain permits before certain activities can be done on a radio station. Example, permit to purchase equipment, permit to import equipment. Again, we are not an equipment manufacturing country, so we always import, and demo permit, construction permit, etc. So as I mentioned earlier, the latest amendment to Act 3846 actually did not improve, in my opinion lang naman, did not improve the law, but it actually added more permits. So, wala pang ease of doing business before. Okay, so since the early 1990s, the NTC has actually had to issue more regulation for mobile radio network as more as people demanded for more mobile phone services. So mobile services actually exploded, no? Nagkaroon tayo ng mobile phone boom. Baka marami sa inyo hindi pa pinapanganak noon, pero the growth was exponential. And mobile subscription overtook landline subscription by the year 2000. Okay, what do we have to remember? If miscalculated or misinformed, regulation can actually serve to stifle innovation and competition. So for example, in 1990, back then, meron pa tayong Department of Transportation and Communication. Wala pa si DICT nun. So the DOTC issued a department circular that limited the number of nationwide mobile operators to only 2 entities. I actually don't know the rationale behind this, but it's probably not to crowd out the landline operators. So, kailangan 2 entities lang daw. But a couple of years later, the OTC reversed its own circular and it opened the mobile. When you see CMTS, that's mobile, cellular mobile telephone system, to any number of players as long as radio frequencies are available. Okay, second, regulatory issuances need the flexibility to adapt to market changes. So, for example, in the past, the DOTC issued a department circular for interconnection for parang PTs only for landline operators. But then it had to change the DC and quickly add that interconnection will also be done between a landline operator and a mobile operator kasi nga dumadami ng mobile operator. Before, there were a lot of licenses for mobile operators. Not only 3 that we have now. Oh, sorry, 4 pala that we have now. Actually, 2 being the biggest, PLDT group and Globe. The third one being Dito. And then there's also now Telecom. Okay, next. Sorry, I can see hands being raised. Should I address any questions now or not really? Maybe later?
Maybe later? Yes, Ms.
Alright,
Grace.
sorry, thank you. Okay, so next. Regulation can impose standards to ensure quality of service, safety, and security. So for example, NTC actually, NTC has issued memorandum circulars for technical plans, let's say for telecom transmission, signaling, numbering, and also for service performance standards for mobile. NTC also certifies wireless and wireless related products, which is important for Open RAN. It issues type approvals for telecom products and type acceptance for wireless products. So sometimes issuances can be outpaced, no? Actually, most of the time. Regulatory issuances are outpaced by the changes in the market. So, for example, si DOTC issued department circular in the 80s pa to. So, si NTC issued a memorandum circular requiring a subscriber of a mobile service to obtain a permit to purchase and possess prior to the acquisition of radio equipment. So, imagine that. So, the result was that each subscriber, that's you and me, had to apply for an NTC permit before we could purchase a mobile phone. Of course, that would have made sense if it were just a few hundreds, diba, subscribers. But due to the poor landline coverage before, well, actually, obsolete na nga halos yung landline ngayon, many Filipinos, no matter how expensive mobile phones were, actually resorted to mobile services. So the NTC soon was, as expected, flooded with applications. And barely 3 years after, the NTC decided to issue an MC suspending the licensing requirement for mobile subscribers indefinitely. So, thank God. Otherwise, kailangan natin lahat may permit. So, ngayon, ano na lang, type approved na lang yung ano natin, yung mobile phones. And it's the mobile network operator that gets the permit. Okay, so for radio spectrum, we actually have various policies. I won't go through all of these anymore. Okay, so Act 846, I mentioned this earlier, you regulate, it's the radio spectrum policy framework, and it regulates construction, establishment, operation of radio stations, pati manufacturing, etc. RA 7925 provides the goal, actually, for why the state has to regulate radio frequency. So, radio frequency being a scarce public resource, it must be administered in the public interest, okay? Not in the interest of the industry players, but the public interest, in accordance with international agreements and conventions. Very, very tricky yung 7925 actually, because it was the vehicle by which the government actually wanted to put the private sector front and center. Siya yung magiging engine of growth of the telecoms industry. So it was actually encouraging the private sector to invest in infrastructure, invest in technology, etc. But at the same time, the NTC, before pa to, wala pa tayong mga competition laws before. The NTC was sort of also tasked to make sure that there is fair competition among the industry players. And thirdly, it was also mandated to make sure that the rights of consumers are protected. So tatlo yon. So balancing act yon. That's a very, very difficult task, I think, for just one agency. And at the time that the NTC was tasked with this mandate in 1995, wala pang DICT, wala pang Philippine Competition Commission. So, although may DTI na for consumer rights. So, just to bear in mind, no, the huge, kumbaga, the huge responsibility of an industry regulator, of an industry so big as telecoms and ICT. Okay, okay. So, I won't go through these. I just listed them down just so you would see what the policy framework contains. Okay, so the rules on spectrum allocation, the primary reason for spectrum regulation is to prevent harmful interference. Very technical siya, no? Harmful interference. But as I said, the technical is the most, kumbaga, petics na yun eh. Diba? But it's really the balancing of the different interests. For example, the interests of the industry players themselves, who gets which spectrum, how much, and for how long. That's actually the very essence of what politics is. My background, actually, by the way, is in political science. And politics is defined as deciding which or who gets what, meaning what resources, when, how, and how much. So parang sa spectrum regulation, this is a microcosm of politics actually. So just a side note there. So the NTC already issued rules on spectrum allocation, assignment, recall, and reassignment as early as 1996. Kahit na nung hindi pa ganun kalaki yung mobile telephony. But this rule is actually very important. It is very comprehensive. And one thing that stands out here is that while spectrum is assigned administratively, so you need to apply with the NTC and then you get a reply of approval or not. Recalling spectrum from an assignee, so from an entity, actually requires service of notice and a public hearing. So this is actually what's called a quasi-judicial process. Parang ano yan, parang litigation yan, parang court parang court proceeding yan. So, it's very difficult to recall, although it's relatively easier to assign spectrum. Okay. So here is a summary of the key spectrum regulation that we have in the Philippines. So allocation is aligned with international agreements such as the ITU, which actually makes spectrum assignment the most important spectrum management function of the NTC. Assignment is an administrative process, as I just mentioned, but bear in mind that access to spectrum can also be done through other means. For example, applying for co-use or joint use. Usually, you don't see this in the rules, but in in reality, usually when a telco acquires a smaller entity or a telco that has a spectrum assignment, instead of requesting to recall that spectrum and then get it reassigned to the entity that acquired the spectrum, usually yung ginagawa as a workaround is to apply for joint use of the spectrum. So the spectrum assignee is retained, which is the smaller entity, pero spectrum is being used by the acquiring entity or the bigger telco. O, diba? May ano tayo dyan. Mga parang Instagram versus reality yan. Okay. Spectrum user fee. So unlike in other countries where revenues from spectrum come from auctions, in the Philippines, we collect spectrum user fees or SUF annually. So it's computed differently based on the service. So medyo complicated yung computation yan. Actually, there have been a lot of proposals to rationalize spectrum user fee collection. Pero syempre, pag industry player ka, ang idea mo ng rationalization, babaan yung spectrum user fee. Pero if you're the government, ang objective mo for rationalization is to actually, for the government or the state to get more revenues from spectrum. Okay, spectrum terms of license. Actually, this is, in the Philippines, this is aligned to the life of a congressional franchise. This is very unique to the Philippines kasi we are the only country in the world that requires Congress to pass a law. By the way, I forgot to tell you, a franchise is a Republic Act. So it's a law passed by Congress. So each network operator applies for a franchise. So Congress will go through the whole lawmaking process, which usually takes 2 years if you're lucky. So after getting a franchise, then you can be granted a CPCN. The CPCN from the NTC cannot have terms and conditions that are contrary to your franchise. So if you think about it in a way, radio spectrum use in the Philippines is dependent on the political process of Congress. Kasi Congress is made up of elected officials, basically politicians. So we are subjecting spectrum management, assignment, etc. to a political process. And that has its own challenges kasi the political process is very unpredictable and it's based on a lot of discretion. And if you look at public policy and public administration, those two things are dangerous to have. Okay, that's my personal opinion. But hindi lang personal yan actually. Many studies have actually pointed that out. And that's one of the things that we need to change. Okay, regional licensing. Actually, mobile access spectrum in the early 1990s were assigned on a national or regional basis. But somewhere along the way, that changed actually. National or nationwide basis na lang ngayon ng spectrum licensing, which also has its own challenges because then we don't get to maximize spectrum. Diba, remember one of the principles or reasons for managing spectrum is to maximize its use, no? Efficient use. And efficient use shouldn't just be about assigning spectrum to the biggest player with the most number of subscribers. We can actually argue based on good governance. that efficient use can also be about making sure that unutilized public resource such as spectrum can be assigned or shared with other players in communities where there is no connectivity. So we definitely need to look into the spectrum management policy that we have so that regulation will also follow suit. Okay. Bidding or open tender. Um, this is this is actually provided in law, but this is not practiced in the Philippines. The law says that whenever demand for specific frequencies exceeds availability of frequencies, then the NTC can carry out a bidding process. But we have never done this before for one reason or another. Sorry, I'm sorry if you're hearing the noise from my notes. Paper-based pa rin ako. I'm analog that way. Okay. Okay, so spectrum review, it's done periodically, but the law doesn't say the frequency. Pun intended, no frequency. Pero that's also confusing. It doesn't say how many times spectrum review is done. Co-use is allowed, but spectrum trading is not. Spectrum trading within or among industry players is not allowed. We have provisions for open and unprotected spectrum. It's defined by regulation. And recently there have been issuances on this pertaining to zero SUF or zero spectrum use. I won't get into the details, but we can discuss offline if you want. And finally, do we have, wait lang. Okay. So we don't have, I think I skipped it, no, the roadmap, the spectrum roadmap was mentioned earlier. We don't have a spectrum roadmap, which means, like, for example, in Australia, they look 5 years ahead and they plan out how spectrum will be allocated and assigned or for which services, and to encourage then investment. Actually, when you have a roadmap, the private sector, whenever they invest, they need a stable environment, they need predictability, so a spectrum roadmap would definitely help. We don't have that, unfortunately, and there is also no publicly available spectrum assignment database. I think at one point, or through an FOI, a Freedom of Information request, I think the NTC said that they need to protect the privacy of the assignees. Pero bear in mind that the Data Privacy Act, for example, deals with personal information of individuals. So, sa spectrum assignment naman, hindi naman, unless individuals yung inassignan mo niyan. So usually, in other countries na lang, let's just say, in other countries, this is actually available. And I have, colleagues from my own ICT policy network globally, and who have told me that the database for spectrum assignment in their country is actually available. Okay. Finally, policy and regulation consideration for open RAN. No, actually, we needed to have that background of the policy and regulatory environment. Kasi, unless a new law is passed, then nothing from what I've told you would change. So, for example, a Republic Act that says that a congressional franchise is necessary to build a mobile network cannot be superseded by, let's say, the NTC just deciding to say na, oh, you don't need a congressional franchise anymore. May hierarchy kasi yan. The hierarchy is the Constitution, the highest law of the land, a Republic Act by Congress, then an executive order, and then the department issuances and memorandum circulars. So that's why it's important to recognize and be aware of the general frameworks first. Okay. So given the Philippines policy and regulatory environment, what would be the considerations for Open RAN? Okay. Telecom policy and regulation were developed, they were designed for analog telecom services. And when I say analog telecom services, we're talking of your landline, Because that's what the basis of RA 7925 was. That's your local exchange carrier service, fixed landline telephone, and analog mobile radio services. That's why regulation needs to be updated to promote Open RAN. Actually, yung description pa lang ng Open RAN, sobrang ng high-tech, di ba? Parang how can you possibly put Open RAN in the context of a very analog era policy framework? So what do we need to do? Well, and I'm not just saying this. This is the result of the recommendation of various studies, including the World Bank, the PIDS, even the ADB, and UP, various studies. First, we need to simplify the licensing requirement for building and operating a network to follow global practice, which is a license comes from a ministry or department of ICT or the industry regulator. It's actually an administrative process coming from the executive agency if they had it. So let's get rid of the political process because licensing is a very technical function. The congressional franchise must be removed and the licensing be fully delegated to the NTC. Spectrum licensing must also be updated. Again, removing the franchise kasi again, spectrum licensing also involves or requires the franchise. Open RAN can actually be more easily propagated by allowing non-PTEs. Kasi pag PTE, may franchise. Basically, non-enfranchised entities to pilot test the technology and the standard. So, by doing that, you can also do regional assignment and sharing of spectrum unutilized in certain areas so that you can democratize access to Open RAN by community networks. So, in areas where Open RAN is, in areas where we have redundant connectivity, I guess it's easy because the enfranchised telcos are already here, like the highly urbanized areas. But in the unserved and unserved areas, underserved and unserved, where most of the time the big telcos are not present, there are non-telco service providers who can actually be tapped for this. So if the franchise cannot be removed in the immediate term, NTC can perhaps ease restrictions on some permits. For example, yung mga demo permit. Kasi ang demo naman, it's not yet a commercial deployment. It's just a testing stage. So, if you review the radio control law, there is nothing there naman that says to demonstrate a wireless tech, you need a congressional franchise na. Remember that the telecom service or a mobile radio service is offering the service to the public for a fee. So a demo is not yet at that stage. So the NTC needs to also assess Open RAN equipment. So type approval is very important. But then now the NTC has to grapple with a multiple vendor environment. So the hardware would be different, and the RAN can also, since it can also be virtualized software-based siya, then the NTC also needs to assess what kind of approval is necessary for such a configuration. Okay. Since Open RAN is a mobile standard, so spectrum should be made available. Securing sufficient spectrum for Open RAN deployment could be very challenging, particularly for new entrants or smaller operators. If you recall, in 2018, there was a third telco selection process. I was fortunate enough to be a part of that. I was the civil society representative that observed the selection process at the NTC. And many opinion came out of, because of that selection process. But one of the things that stood out was that the Philippine Competition Commission at the time said that insufficient frequencies for mobile actually, in certain bands, discourage the entry of new players. Um, it's kumbaga, as I mentioned earlier, when you're an investor, you need predictability, you need a stable environment, and you need to make sure, you need to know that there is sufficient resources available to you when you want to invest here. So right now, actually, even outside of the issue of Open RAN, if another mobile network operator would want to enter the market, it would be very difficult because of the lack of mobile frequency. Exclusive assignment of spectrum on a nationwide basis to just one entity might also prevent new players or other smaller players from taking advantage of Open RAN or offering it as a service, or actually even on a trial basis in certain communities, because you need spectrum to demonstrate and you need the permit for that. So lagi siyang nakakabit sa franchise, that is very, very limiting. To make more spectrum available, spectrum sharing could be done, perhaps on a regional basis. We don't have a spectrum sharing policy except for one memorandum circular on TV white space. Also another emerging technology. But that spectrum sharing is only limited to the ICT. And it's limited to VHF, which is actually more scarce than UHF sana. But that's another issue. Okay. Open RAN deployment may require significant investment in infrastructure, so including the RAN, backhaul, and network management systems. RA 7925 contains the national policy for telecoms, and it has put the primary role for offering telecom services to the private sector. Privatized ang telecom sector in the Philippines. That is why the government does not really play a big role, except to fill some gaps. The government, so as a result, the government might not be too keen on allocating public funds for Open RAN deployment, given that the budget for, let's say, the ICT, for example, is focused on its national flagship programs, such as the National Fiber Backbone or the free Wi-Fi and other digitalization projects. So public funding for emerging standards might be very limited. However, special financing mechanisms could be considered. Example would be the Strategic Investment Priority Plan, or SIPP, and also some PPP, or public-private partnership mechanisms. Just a side note, my personal view, public spending in digital infra, if you look at history, has not really shown much success. So like any standard, like other tech standards, market investment and demand is actually the key to a successful deployment for any standard, including Open RAN. Okay. In terms of interoperability and standards, there are challenges in terms of aligning technology specs, addressing interoperability issues, and effective coordination because of the multi-vendor deployment. In this case, the NTC would be the primary actor because of its mandate for setting standards and ensuring interoperability. So, but bear in mind that the Philippines, well, the standards that we adhere to is actually those from international organizations to which the Philippines is signatory. Okay. Siguro let's check what we know. Is Open RAN equipment commercially available? Yes, but they all need NTC type approval. Is Open RAN commercially deployed by our local telcos? No, it's still at the proof of concept stage. And this needs approval from the NTC in terms of demo. But the demo permit needs a telco endorsement. How can Open RAN become a standard? Right now, industry and academe can become a member of the ORAN Alliance and participate in defining Open RAN requirements and specifications. This actually doesn't need government approval, so anyone from the industry and the academe can participate. How does the Philippines adopt a mobile telecom standard? As I mentioned earlier, we're a member state of the ITU, and the government on our behalf signs international and executive agreements with the ITU and other global standards body. So, like any new standard, Open RAN requires training and skills development for engineers, technicians, and other personnel. But bear in mind that the human resource challenge is not really huge for the private sector. It's actually bigger for the industry regulator. Kasi adopting new tech, looking at a new business model, new standards, etc., is actually on the regulator. So the NTC must undergo relevant training and upskilling to deal with new requirements and challenges of a multi-vendor mobile market. But since the DICT is the policy-making body, it also needs to undergo training and skills, capacity building, and other agencies that need to deal with Open RAN, such as the National Privacy Commission for data privacy concerns, and other agencies that might need to look into this would be the Philippine Competition Commission, because vendor lock-in, for example, is anti-competitive, and that needs to be prevented so the PCC can come in. So the diverse and competitive vendor ecosystem as a result of Open RAN will now need to be understood by all these government agencies, and that would take time and effort. Okay, finally, we go to the last few slides. So cybersecurity, data privacy, cloud, and AI. The features of Open RAN, the key features of Open RAN, are also actually its greatest challenges when it comes to cybersecurity. So again, security and privacy concerns related to software-defined networking, virtualization, multiple vendors must be assessed and addressed. Also, the decentralization of control can also increase the number of threat vectors in the surface area for attacks. So that's a potential danger there that must be addressed. A new law, RA 11659, or the Amendment to the Public Service Act, actually classifies telecoms, officially classified telecoms as a critical infrastructure. So it must comply with information security standards. In the most recent National Cybersecurity Plan for 2023 to 2028, which, by the way, was promulgated as an executive order, executive number 58, also requires critical infrastructure to submit certain requirements. So, kumbaga, hindi lang yung the technical aspect of Open RAN. All of these requirements, reports, assessments, certifications, and compliance with data privacy, cybercrime law, etc., needs to be in place. Okay, for data privacy, again, and many people tend to forget this kasi, so I'm reminding everyone. Data Privacy Act is about protecting personal information in information and communication systems, or ICS. The law defines the functions of personal information controller, or PI controller, and processor, including third parties who are hired to perform the function. So the challenge in a multiple vendor and virtualized environment is to identify the PI controller and processor if there will be new ones, and their obligations need to be clear under the DPA. So the DPA is concerned with PI. It is not concerned with data breach, or at least not all data breaches, unless the breach involves personal information. Okay. Okay, let's go up to the cloud. The government has a cloud-first policy, so only for government, which prescribes the use of cloud computing solutions for all executive agencies. Executive agencies only because this is a department circular, while ensuring that there are cybersecurity controls in place. So cloud service providers, whether they are based in the Philippines or not, need to be accredited. And they have to comply with local and international cybersecurity standards. An important note here, data localization. So there's been a much buzz about data localization. There is no data localization or residency requirement, which means that the data you store or process can be done in facilities abroad. However, there are restrictions. So sensitive, above sensitive, and highly sensitive government data that you process in your mobile network, for example, would need to comply with certain levels of data residency requirements, especially the highly sensitive government data. Okay. Now, on the hot topic of AI, the flavor of the month. We do not have a policy or regulation on AI yet. However, some government agencies, such as the Department of Trade and Industry, already issued a national AI strategy roadmap. But the objective is to promote innovation for business. The Department of Science and Technology worked on an AI research and development strategy. So again, the objective is how to develop AI. The DICT and the Civil Service Commission are working on a set of principles and guidelines for ethical and trustworthy use of AI in the government. So I'm emphasizing this because AI, many agencies are excited about AI development and deployment, but the legislature is quite worried about AI development, such that several House bills have already been filed, which aims to introduce a governance framework for AI. Some of them even proposing to regulate AI now. So the key concern is to exercise full human control over AI, unless we want to have our AI overlord in the near future. Okay, finally, while there are global initiatives aimed at helping develop standards, foster interoperability, and advocate for favorable policies for Open RAN, we must remember the following. One, policy and regulation can and should create an environment where new technology and innovation can be freely introduced and thrive. Policy should not be technology specific. That is actually the biggest pitfall of all our laws. 7925, 3846, etc. And public funding can fill in gaps resulting from market failure. So to encourage market adoption, you can have some segments of the country where there's public funding, let's say for open AI deployment, for underserved areas. But in the end, market adoption will be the best determinant of the fate of tech or any standard.